What is up, everybody, and welcome back to the Top Cut Academy. First, I just want to start off by saying thank you, everyone who tuned into the vlog that I did. It was a really good fun time making, although it didn't get as much viewership as some of our other videos. It's just something I wanted to do, mainly for myself and you guys, just so I give you a little bit of a look into the insight and get to know me a little bit better as well. I tend to find myself a good person to be around. So I hope that that was sort of well received through the video as well. And then I just want to give a quick apology. Not that there's many of you out there, but of course I do want to upload things pretty consistently onto the channel. But I've only really been able to make some funny shorts in the last couple of weeks after getting back from the two regionals. I was obviously editing the vlog the 1 week, which took quite a while because it ended up being quite long. And then last week I was working away and on night shifts. So that was quite difficult to sort of get anything done during the day. I had obviously other adult responsibilities, cleaning, cooking, etc. So that is now over. I am home. I have had some time this week to sort of get back into making some videos, and this is where we started. I know that by the time this is coming out, all of you will be probably traveling or already in Sao Paulo, but I still think it's worth to bring out just because I can put this out, sort of put down a marker of where I thought everything was going to be before I watch and you watch this weekend, or compete, and then we can come back and look at it afterwards and see sort of where we were. As you know, I do like to review these sort of events, but I think from that point on, it's going to be a lot of Phantasmal Flames content, obviously the regionals and tournaments within that format, but also some new decks and things like that, as I've got a little bit more time over the next couple of weeks to put some time in the content. I hope you like the background for this. I tried to design some Brazilian Pokeballs for this, and they look pretty terrible. So I spent some time trying to do that. But anyway, without further ado, the reason you're here to look at what I think the top 10 decks for LAIC. I just want to sort of jump in now and say that this is not a tier list. This is completely based on opinion, all backed up by sort of personal experience and data, to what I think is the best deck for the event. So I think that sometimes there are really good decks in the format, but they might not be a good play for the weekend based on previous results of the regionals. As I said, there is going to be a geography bias, so sometimes different places around the world, like I think that Europe tends to play Dragapult a little bit more than America does. America tends to play Guardi a little bit more than Europe does. And I do tend to find, has always been the case since I've been playing, is a lot of South America tends to play a little bit more of an aggressive play style. Over the years that I've sort of been around, and you've had some great players there coming out with sort of like the more aggressive versions of a lot of decks, and we saw that obviously earlier this season as well in Belo Horizonte, when Gustavo Wada actually made a pretty sort of hard-hitting Guardi deck that hasn't actually seen much success outside of that tournament. Those Mystery Gardens and the Mega Guardi sort of hitting hard in that. So that sort of shows sort of how I'm basing some of these biases based on the geography of the tournament. Without further ado, let's get into our list. And I think that number 10 is Flareon Box. This is the deck that I've probably spent the most time with so far this season. Pretty much picked up all of my points with it. This or Ho-Oh Box. But yeah, Flareon, a deck that, although I really like, it did not have a good time in Vegas. I think that obviously coming off the back of Gdansk, Lille, where it had a really good showing, obviously Emma Hagen then taking it to a second place finish. It's not that people sort of expected it to continue to have a good time. I just think compared, it didn't have that good of a time in Vegas. There were still quite a few in day two, but none of them sort of making those upper echelons of the numbers of that tournament. This might be due to the fact that it is very skill intensive, but also it hasn't got a great Guardi matchup, and it also has a really bad Pult matchup. And I think that, earlier in the day, maybe in those Swiss rounds day one, if you do feel very competent with EVBox and you know the matchups inside out, you'll probably be able to get around some of those Polt and Guardy players. But as we saw sort of in the money match the other week, that even someone as high as Emma Hagen's standard with this deck wasn't able to best someone like Harry Chow, who knew the lines of Guardy and was able to sort of dispatch her quite easily 4-0. So I think that, you're always running the risk that you want to sort of see the matchups that aren't as popular, if you get what I mean. You're sort of hoping to get into some of those middling 50-50 matchups. Obviously, I mentioned Goldengo because it's a good matchup and one of the better decks, but you're sort of talking about those Zoroarks, those Marnie's Grimmsnarls, sort of those, foddery decks in the middle, things that take a little bit to set up because Burning Charge can be really aggressive early on and get through things. So I think that they're the sort of decks that you're looking to try and face. And unfortunately, there are going to be times that you run into Polt and Guardy, and on those rounds, you're going to have to make sure that you're playing at your absolute highest standard to be able to get over the line. And all the Guardy players don't have to play at the highest standard to have a decent time into you. I think the other thing I want to mention is that the reason I think it just about gets on the list in front of a couple of other things is due to the fact that it's got countless lines and options. I think we saw that in a lot of the top cut games in Gdansk the other month, just because of EV boxes, sort of Flareon boxes, EV boxes, either one, ability to sort of go down different lines, whether you prize EVs, need to use Blood Moon, stuff like that. So there are things you can do that maybe your opponent doesn't see coming that allow you to get the edge in a lot of matchups. But I think that 10 is the perfect place for it until it starts to perform a little bit more consistency or finds an answer to those bad matchups. Then number 9, I think, is Cerulege, a little bit more of a linear and aggressive deck, and something that I do think will be quite popular this weekend. As I said, a lot of the South Americans like those aggressive decks with more aggressive lines, so I do think that Cerulege will be more popular than it was last weekend. It does have sort of much worse matchups into the big two than first thought. I think when Mega Revolution first came out, the rocks were added to the deck, people were sort of very much banking on the fact that Cerulege had a good Gardevoir matchup and an okay Dragapult matchup. I think over time, and sort of the Guardy list more moving to Jealous and Guardies and text coming in and stuff like that, I think that it turns out that Cerulege maybe doesn't have as good. They're still 50-50s or maybe slightly unfavoured, but they don't have as good of a matchup into those as it first did, which is obviously a little bit disappointing for those who sort of put the man hours into this deck, thinking they do, and maybe once they get to sort of the higher rankings in tournaments, they find out that actually it doesn't have a lot of the answers that they need to get over some of the more convoluted decks in the format. I think the biggest thing with Cerulege, though, although it's been very prevalent in the format, it's been a lot more popular than it has in the last couple of months. It's actually not had that impressive finish or top cut yet. I think it's bubbled a couple of times. I know that there was a disqualification at the first regional of the Mega Evolution tournament, which one would have gotten to cut but didn't. But thus far, there's not really been a really impressive finish for Cerulege, and I think that sort of shows that although it gets consistent day 2 conversions, it's not actually making that extra jump into the upper echelons of those rankings, sort of showing those linear lines of the deck and that it can be found out, just from a slow start, so on and so forth. The other thing I do like about the deck is it does have answers into tricky walls, stalls, stuff like that. So if anyone's trying to soul block you or clutch you, you have the Jet Energies, you have the Turos that are still played sort of at a heavy count in the deck. I've seen up to 3 Jet Energies in some decks. I've seen 2 Turos and a Pelpad. So you do always have answers to those. And then obviously Cornerstone isn't able to stop you as you don't have an ability, so on and so forth. So the deck is able to sort of play every matchup, which is definitely a plus, as some decks really do struggle against some of those wall and stall things. But yeah, Cerulege number 9 on the list this time. And in number 8, now I would just like to say, obviously I've got 1 week to go. When I wrote this, it was 1 week to go. But I think that Enzoroark, a really, really powerful deck. It has been shown countless times by some of the South American players, Gabriel Fernandez, but of course Liam Halliburton sort of being the forefront leader on this deck. And I think that it, with such a high skill ceiling, if it's not something you've already been playing prior to your testing for this event, maybe you went to Vegas, didn't have a good time, or went to Buenos Aires, didn't have a good time, and you're thinking of picking up Zoroark, it wouldn't really be my advice to take it at that point. I would wait maybe a couple more weeks, months, and especially with the new end Zekrom that got announced, maybe look to play it then when it's sort of got a big heavy attacker as well. Because I just think that there's some really, really, really intricate lines that even some of the best players in the world aren't able to see sometimes, just because you need to spend an awful lot amount of time with a deck and really see all of the combos you can put together. Because sometimes, it might look like you need to attack on certain turns or not attack and do things, but actually, you know, waiting to do something else is always correct and something like that. And I think that Liam Halliburton over the weekend, I think a lot of the commentators were sort of showing that in, not no offense to the commentators, but they were sort of like, where is he going with these lines? You know what I mean? And then once he did them, they were like, oh my gosh, that was really incredible. We didn't really see that coming, sort of thing. And I think that that's sort of the brain space that you need to be in before playing this deck, that you're sort of playing chess and your opponent's playing checkers, you know what I mean? Like, you're seeing things and you're doing lines that they can't really play around or see coming. So I do think for that reason it's a little bit lower on the list, because it's not something that I think that everyone should be picking up and playing. It should be played by those people who are I don't want to say masters in the deck, but sort of have mastered those intricate turns in the deck. And I think that the day 2 win rate proves that. Obviously, if you go to look, Zoroark, the people who play it convert with it, maybe make day 2, but in day 2, a lot of its win rate falls away and it doesn't actually do that well in day 2, apart from those small few that go on to obviously make second place, like Liam Halliburton, finish in the top 16, because the players you've got the players that are good with the deck and players that are absolute masters with the deck who are able to see those extra things. I could talk about it all day, but it's really important to know this inside out. Obviously, it can suffer more to aggressive decks, and as I've already discussed, I think that the South of America likes and favors more aggressive decks, and I think they will be more unpopular than they have been over the last couple of months of regionals. So I think that Zoroark may have to dodge and weave a little bit more at this tournament than it has done the last couple of months. And then I think that the biggest thing is it's very undecided on what variant is best. I actually watched a really interesting interview with Liam Halliburton, sort of, I think it was around his top 8 match, talking about Zoroark, and he said that he put in the Darmanitan line and went down to 1 Reshiram just because he felt like it was going to be okay for this weekend, but he himself doesn't even know if it's the best way to play the deck. And I'll be honest, I think if Liam Halliburton at this point doesn't know if it's the best way to play the deck, then I don't think anyone else will. And I just think that's because maybe that was a good call for this weekend, or should I say at Vegas, but it might not be a good call for the weekend after. So I think that the fact that it sort of doesn't have a decided 60, some decks are playing Serrano, some decks aren't, some decks are playing Petulant with a Mochi, some decks aren't. Some are playing, obviously, Darmanitan, as I mentioned, some are playing a thicker Reshiram line. And, there's all these things. Some are playing more controlling cards, Ares, Erosix. Some are just going more for consistency. So I think that sort of the way that you've built it into your play style is always the correct thing to do, but obviously the most efficient and effective version of the deck has not been decided, I don't think, and so that is a little bit of a worry as well. And just one final point, as everyone knows, Zoroark, really good time into Gardevoir and really good time into Dragapult as well. So that is always important to keep in mind if you think those decks are going to be in the high numbers of popularity, those 15, those 20%, then always a good deck to keep in mind. But just make sure that you have your P's and Q's down with it. And number 7, Marnie's Grimmsnarl. I will be completely honest, I have always been a humongous Marnie's Grimmsnarl hater. Those who've watched the channel previously will know that I just don't really think that this deck has what it takes to make consistent results, and that's why I don't think it's played in the high percentages, even when it does well. However, I will say it has performed much better than I did think it would. It's obviously not had multiple high finishes like at tournaments, so it might have like one mate cut at each regional, or one mate cut, one just outside top 16, stuff like that. But even that is more than I'd thought I would see from the deck. So from that point of view, you can paint me impressed. I think that Mike Ellis, some fantastic games on stream that he played with the deck as well, that really showed off some of the strengths when you know how to play it. But I do think that the deck struggles a lot from sort of stage 2 problems, bricky, and I think that you almost have to utilize every single spot in the deck. There's no room for text, there's no room for any sort of slip ups, as you have to play such a thin line of your main attacker, such a thin line of the Frost Lasses, just to keep everything consistent and running. And obviously that can sometimes come back to bite you, which can be upsetting. Sometimes it might be a really good matchup that you think you're going into, and all of a sudden you started an impidimp and you're passing. So I do think that it's important to make sure that you get the maximum amount of consistency out of the list that you're playing, and sort of, rather than test into matchups and learning lines and stuff like that, maybe just test how often you're getting into games, how often you're setting up, and what cards you can put into the deck to make sure you get into them more often. And then once you solve that problem, then start looking into how to actually play through the matchups. It does obviously have a very strong Gardevoir matchup, always has done, and that has always been sort of the biggest indicator of why you should want to play this deck. And then it does have a good Dragapult matchup, a good Charizard matchup, anything sort of stage 2 and evolving, mainly because you can be a little bit of a menace in the early game if you sort of get candy into Grimmsnarl and start sniping things and they don't get to evolve. But more than that, you obviously play the de-evolution TM as well, just to set up sort of 6 prize, 5 prize turns late on and wipe your opponent's board. I do think one of the biggest drawbacks of the deck, though, is that it has a very, very, very weak Mega Absol box matchup. And I think that obviously Tord winning will always boost popularity more than other things. So let's say Dragapult wins on a weekend, but it's not played by Tord. I think that the percentages will go up by 3, maybe 5%. When Tord wins with the deck, though, he's almost like a messiah. People will flock to that, and you can even see the deck rise 5 to 10%. And I do think that will be the case with Mega Absol this weekend. I think that people will want to go back to that deck and will want to play it again. Maybe changing things up, maybe taking the cornerstones back out, maybe putting them in because they think they're going to be counted. Who knows for sure? But one thing I can be certain of is people will start to pick up that deck again. And unfortunately for Grimmsnarl, that is not a good thing. And then, of course, Devo and Clutch can win very poor matchups. Even if you're on the back foot a lot of the time, if you know your opponent has run out of resources to pick things up, stuff like that, you can always clutch with Yveltal and spread that damage with Frostlass, Munkidori, and you can sort of cheese out games that way, which is a really, really big strength to have. There's a lot of decks that can sort of sit back in poor matchups and just get railed, get run off the board, and there's not a lot that you can do. Whereas Grimmsnarl can have a bit of fight back at all times, just because it's got those disruptive resources at his hands, and obviously Devolution plays a similar role. And then I think that the other thing on top of Mega Absol is, the Goldengo matchup. I think the Goldengo is probably the second, if not the best deck in format. It's I would say second for me. I think Guardi has always been the best deck in format. Spoilers alert. But I think everyone would pretty much know it would be in spot 1 or 2 anyway. But I think that the problem with Grimmsnarl is it does struggle into Goldengo, and whether Goldengo is the best or not, it's always going to be a high percentage played, just because it is quite easy to pick up for newcomers as well. And although there tends to be more intricate lines in the deck now that the Solrock and Lunatone have been added in, it is also a beginner-friendly deck. And so I do think those percentages will always be high. And of course, when you get into those later rounds, those players will really know how to get the most out of their turns and make it rain for as much money as possible, i.e. discarding as many energies as possible. So Marnie's Grimmsnarl, I think that the deck, I wanted to sort of show my respect for the deck by putting it up a couple of numbers from maybe where I would have had it at the start of the format, which would have been in that 9 or 10 space. But I do think it has done quite well over the last couple of regionals. It would be unfair to count it out completely. So number 7 this time. And number 6, Charizard Pidgeot. I think that The reason I've dropped this to 6 is that it sort of was in a really precarious position in the last couple of weeks. It won the first regional that we had. Obviously, Jackson Ford taking it all the way. And I think since then, it's just been really lackluster. I think it's been found out a little bit. I think that more matchups have turned up that it's maybe not that favoured into. And, the problem with playing 2 stage 2s and sometimes even 3 stage 2s if you're trying to fit a dust noir line in as well, you're almost using up, again, similar to the Grimsnarl thing I just spoke about, like you are using every single slot in the deck to try and make the deck run. So it can almost leave you no space for any sort of power cards or anything like that, or tech cards to help you out in certain matchups or get sort of big combos off. And I know that Charizard is a combo deck anyway because of those stage 2s, but that's sort of the point I'm making. You can't ever throw in a tool scrapper or a jamming tower or an Eri, I don't know, a tech card that can stall your opponent out like a Sob, just because every single card needs to be utilized to obviously get the Charizard on board and attacking for good damage. So I do think that although it's good and bad matchups are the same as always, a good time into God of War, I think still not a great time into Dragapult. I think that there are obviously things you can do with Psyduck. There's things you can do with Mist Energy, but I still think overall, like if you're using up those spaces to do that, your deck gets worse. And are you throwing away your consistency in the matchups just to get a better time in a Dragapult that, in my opinion, doesn't feel as strong as it was anyway? I don't know. So I think that that's one consideration to make. But I think that the most important thing that I saw sort of looking into the data at both Vegas, Buenos Aires, actually lost more than it won into Goldengo, which, Charizard has always sort of had that little inkling in it that, it should be played because Goldengo is always popular, and Chi-Yu or the Ho-Oh, whatever you might want to play, is a really good answer into Goldengo. But now it's turning out that Goldengo seems to be sort of setting up quicker, getting into the game quicker, and using those Solroks and Lunatones in the early game to its advantage, getting rid of Pidgeys, getting rid of Charmanders, and they're probably taking 1, 2, 3 prizes before you're even into a Charizard and setting up a Chi-Yu for knockouts. And then at that point, they are just able to just draw cards and win the game, So I think that, unfortunately, for Zard, the fact that sort of Goldengo has gone from taking one big knockout on your Charizard, you knocking it out with Chi-Yu, and then them sort of trying to scramble together to get to 330 again. They can take 2 or 3 prizes in the early game without having to overextend and keep those resources so they can get through a Pidgeot and a Charizard late game very easily. So I do think that is not a good thing for Charizard. One of the better reasons to play the deck has now, looks like, started to fade away. Even if that matchup became a 50-50, it used to be a boast, and that is now gone. And then it struggles into Mega Absol box as well. The win percentages are really, really poor looking into the data for that matchup. Obviously, I've not been playing Charizard since I was sort of testing it for Lille, just because I hate Charizard. So it was already a miracle that I'd even testing it for Lille. So I've not actually played that matchup myself, but having watched it a couple of League Cups, and then also sort of looking at the data, I didn't realize just how bad that matchup was. So really, really disappointing there for Charizard. So it actually turns out that maybe that good matchup into Gardevoir isn't enough to make it a play anymore. However, it does thrive on those midland decks, those weaker cards, as it does use the 2 of the strongest cards in the game. Charizard, the text on it will always be strong, it will always be powerful, and of course Quick Search on Pidgeot is one of the best cards in the game. So sometimes just using the power of those cards, and when you get lucky, you are able to sort of bounce through those midland matchups, those 50-50s, just by being very difficult to remove and being a humongous beat stick. And then, as I said, like, Pidgeot provides room for techs. The problem is that by playing those techs, you might take away from your consistency. So is that something that you want to do? Yes or no? That's something you've got to figure out if you want to play Charizard. I would probably say no, just because I think that, playing 2 stage 2s is scary and you want to keep the consistency high. However, we have seen it in the past where these lists have got very greedy and still got over the line. So Number 6 this time with Charizard Pidgeot. I still think that the cards are very powerful. I just don't think it's in the position it was when it run that regional at the start of this format. However, it is important to remember that it did win a regional at the start of this format and definitely has the capability to do so again. Number 5, I think that Terrabox is something that has continued to perform very well in this format for a deck that pretty much picked up little to a small amount of new tricks. It's actually been very, very good. We saw it come second at a European regional. It's had countless top 32s, countless top 16s over the time, and a handful of top 8s as well. So although it's got a very, very high skill cap, like a lot of the knockdown decks, similar to Flareon, I do think that it's something that's been around for a while now, and if you have been playing it by this point, I would imagine that you're pretty competent with the deck to be able to take it. I think the good thing about Terrabox is it's how can you put it? I don't want to say it's the 50-50 deck of the format, because there are some matchups you lose pretty hard to, but it does have good or even matchups, definitely into Guardy and Dragapult, but it does have sort of mid 40s or 55% into quite a lot in the format. So I think if that's something that you're happy to roll with and take on the chin and just sort of be like, I can rely on myself to win me a lot of these matchups, then I would definitely recommend playing Terrabox, because again, it does have those lines and those things that your opponent might not see, especially sort of in day one in those Swiss rounds when you're playing against people who might be newer, might not have played too many games against Terrabox. It's not the most popular deck in the Mega Evolution format. And so, yeah, I do think that it has definite strengths. The problem is that it has a very, very, very lackluster matchup into Mega Absol Box. I think it was something like 28% win percentage in day 2 at Vegas, which is obviously really poor. I think anything over 70% is, you never want to say the word auto loss, but it is not something that you want to be seeing, because chances are you're going to be losing. And as I said, that deck could easily pick up 10% of play rate this weekend just because Tord won Vegas with it. So I think that's definitely something you want to keep in mind. But not only that, like Terrabox does have the room and the capability to put in tech cards, because you're playing knockdown, to maybe make that matchup better. I cannot sit here and tell you what that answer is. I do not know, but I'm sure there are greater minds than mine who maybe want to put in some other cards to make sure that matchup's good. Lots of people were sort of leaning into Leafeon early on, but the problem is if your opponent doesn't put down an Absol, that line doesn't really come off. So it needs to be something that is both good into Kangaskhan and Absol, and I don't think that currently exists. So yeah, that's something that definitely needs to be sorted if you want to feel very confident going into the top cut this weekend. And then sort of the similar thing I said about Marnie's Grimmsnarl, I think that Soblock, Clutch, depending on which deck you're playing, is always a win con and sticky situations. If you feel you're not going to be able to win any other way, you've run out of resources, it's been a long, grindy game, and you're sort of thinking your opponent is low on resources as well, Sob is always a great way to try and win the game. Obviously, you need to be aware of your deck size, your opponent's deck size, what they've used, to make sure you don't, default go into Sob because you're behind, knowing that your opponent's got Jet Energies, Teros, all these sort of things, switches, Petulant, but being aware that that is a option is always a cheeky way to pull off games. So a strength of the deck that not a lot of other things have. And then, of course, you can beat the fodder decks with powerful cards. What I mean by the fodder decks is that, decks that definitely will not make the graphic, decks that people are sort of innovating with, or just there to have a little bit of fun. Powerful cards like Wellspring Ogapon, Noctowl, Pikachu, are always going to be able to beat those decks, because they're able to do so many things they won't have answers for. Decks like that won't be playing random cards like Shaman. Decks like that won't be playing, cards that can sort of burn a Pikachu before trying to get through it, meaning that you'll always get 2 attacks to your Pikachu, so on and so forth. So I think that Terrabox does sort of prey on those decks that aren't meta, and the decks that you don't see on the graphic, which can be something really strong sometimes. Is you might run into those the first 3 rounds of the tournament, for all you know, and then you're looking good, right? So I think Terrabox in 5th place. I think if you were to put it lower, I would completely understand and agree, but I just think there are some really great players playing Terror Box that have performed very well, so I've put it in 5 this time. Then next one, maybe controversially for some, but Dragapult Dust Noir. I've mentioned it a lot in a lot of the videos I've made for the other regionals. I think that this deck has fallen from grace quite a bit. It's obviously still a very powerful card, but I think that there are definitely better decks in this format. And one thing I really wanted to highlight, if you actually go on to Limitless and go to the Vegas results, if you look at the Dragapults in top 16 asymmetrical, there's the Dragapults and another Charizard. But if you actually look at Dragapult's matchups into every other deck in that top cut, they are all in the negative numbers. Now, some obviously closer to 50 than others, but it has a negative matchup into every other deck in that top cut, bar the Charizard. And even the Charizard, if it wanted to, could play text to actually get over the line against the Dragapult. So I think that is something really important to bear in mind, that once again, this Dragapult deck can beat those middling decks. It can have the potential to cheese out games by taking your opponent's setup, so on and so forth, as it always has. But it is really important to remember that the later on into the tournament you get, your good matchups actually start to fade away, and maybe, just maybe, you won't be able to get over the line when you really, really want to and feel like you deserve to after playing very well all weekend. So just keep that in mind before you sort of sleeve this up. I do think that I don't want to say it's a bait, because it's definitely not. The deck has always been very powerful, but maybe, you know, it's something to play if you're looking to make day 2, looking to make points. But I wouldn't say, if you are someone who wants to guarantee yourself getting into top 16, top 8, this is not something I would pick up for this weekend. But it is in the number 4 spot because it is a very, very powerful deck. Dust Noir continues to be an absolute menace in the format. And I think that, you know, if you pick it on the right weekend with the right tech cards in the deck and everything else, I think that you can pretty much bully most things, apart from those bad matchups in sort of Mega Absol box, in Gardevoir and stuff like that. But I think that, you know, for the most part, this card, not great, but I cannot drop it any lower. I can't drop it out of the top 5, just because some of the best players in the world play this deck, and they'll carry this deck to very, very high finishes, as they already have this season. It's obviously had a phenomenal finish already with Alberto Conti as well. So I think that, you know, you're looking at it from a point of view of, okay, Dragapult is very strong, can be very strong. If I'm very good with the deck and put in the right cards, I can have a good weekend. Sure, absolutely, and I think that you know, it's well deserving of the high place it has on this list. But at the same time, it is not a risk I would be taking this weekend. So to bear in mind, I know that all sounds very negative, because I do think there are more negatives than positives to Dragapult at the minute. But based on the people who play it, based on the strength of the card and the way that you can cheese out games, I can't drop it any lower than 4th. But I think that is already quite a significant drop, as this probably would have been in 1st and 2nd in a lot of tier lists for the last 18 months. So Dragapult Dust Noir in 4th place. And 3, Goldengo Rocks for me, I think, is the 1st or 2nd best deck in the format. So I think that it either itself or Gardevoir, that it has a good shout for being in one of those 2 spots. However, for this weekend, I don't think I can put it in one of those 2 spots. Only because I think that Toadbox had such a good weekend that I think a lot of the Goldengo decks will put an answer to Cornerstone in. Now, I would not be playing Goldengo whatsoever without a Cornerstone tech this weekend. But saying that, I think that a lot of the people who've sort of been playing the Absol box for a while, especially Tord, will already have an answer in mind for what to do if that is the case. And so I still don't think you're going to have a good matchup into that deck. and I think that deck will be very, very popular. Now, apart from that, Goldengo continues to have the most insane conversion rate of any deck I've seen for a long time. It was the most popular deck by far last weekend, and its conversion rate was still over 20%, which is insane. I think that the strength of the deck is absolutely phenomenal. I think that the lines that you're able to create by having both one prize and one hit KO modes is something that not a lot of other decks can do, probably apart from God of War. It's always consistent. It pretty much always gets into games between Genesect, between Lunatone, and between Coin Bonus. You've got so many ways to get out of things like Iono, Reset Stamp, stuff like that. So that is obviously very, very important. You being able to play the game, and obviously once you're in the game, it is reliant on you and your skill. So that is always good. And I think that Solrock can absolutely bully in the early game. I have seen over the last couple of weeks, last couple of months, Solrock bullying evolution decks in the early game. Obviously, you can draw a lot of cards. If you're not that bothered about having two prizes down, but you don't want to use resources, you can just use your coin bonuses. You can use your lunar cycles to draw through the deck and just hunt down Charmanders, hunt down Dreepies, hunt down Roltzes, and just really, really put your opponent on the back foot before you start going for those one-hit KOs. So I think that that is a humongous attraction that I have for the deck there, just from the undeniable strength in the early game and the late game that you have from both of your main attackers in the deck. But I think that, as I said, fantastic deck will definitely get you, I say definitely get you points, can never say definitely, very, very high likelihood if you play well to get you points. It will very likely get you into day two, but there are two things. You must play a Cornerstone answer. Do not think that people won't play Cornerstone because the deck did well. You must play a Cornerstone answer. Otherwise, you are going to come into it, you're going to come into Absol Box, which will be popular, and you're going to be upset that you're not able to get around it. Must. However, I do think there will be answers for your Cornerstone answer, but just in case there's not, it is important to have it. But I think that for me, and as I will show you in the number 2 spot right now, I do think Mega Absol Box at the minute is just the slightly better play. That's why I've put it in second. It's got an incredible matchup spread, and I've actually been a bit blown away by how many good matchups this deck actually has. Something like Terminal Period, being able to take down big monster behemoth cards with ease is one thing, but also Claw of Darkness, being able to sort of lock your opponent's hand a little bit. It's not sort of like aggressively locking your opponent, but it can just be times where you're attacking and you take their only supporter, their only ball search card, their counter stadium, their tech card, whatever else. So I think that obviously something like Claw of Darkness, always strong. It's got multiple win cons, some cheesier than others. Mentioned a number of times in this video. You know, you've got Cornerstone that can lock people out of games. You've got Clutch Evatol that can trap people in the active, lock them out of games. You can just Claw of Darkness someone's low hand size, Iono them low, use Claw of Darkness, making sure their hand stays, you know, pretty much unplayable. That's another way to win the game, as well as just being able to Monkey Dory spread while you're clutching in the active and moving your poison damage over with Petulant. There are so many different ways to win the game while playing this deck that you can't play around them all. You've either got a good matchup into this deck where you can blow through it before any of that stuff is able to happen, or they're going to be able to find a way to beat you. And especially when you have high quality players like Tord, Gabriel Fernandez, and people like that, Robin Schultz, obviously playing this in Vegas as well to a high finish. When you've got the caliber of names behind a deck like this, you know that they're going to be able to find those answers. You can't rely on the fact that your opponent's not going to know how to sort of cheese you out of games and stuff. So that is definitely something you need to keep in mind. It's a strong deck played by some of the strongest players in the world, and unless you have a good matchup, you are going to have a really tough time into this. But I think the final thing I want to mention about Absol Box, because you have sort of that inbuilt draw with Kangaskhan, and you sort of have, you know, the cornerstones coming in, cornerstones coming out, a higher penny count, lower penny count, there is definitely room for tech cards. If you feel you need enhanced hammers to get rid of missed energy, so Terminal Period activates more often, there is room. If you feel like you need more draw support, there is room. If you want more gust, once again, there is room. So I think that, you know, it's definitely important to note that you could play one Mega Absol deck and it could be towards 60. You could play another one and it could be completely different. This example happened with me at, I think it was Lille. You know, I've sat down across from Adam Hawkins, and all of a sudden he's dropping a Zerosic and an Eri in back-to-back turns, you know, and I'm sort of like, oh, well, it's, you know, I know some people have teched in some controlling cards, maybe some hammers and stuff like that, but to see both, you know, sort of back-to-back turns was a bit, you know, I was caught a bit off guard by that. And so that is a perfect example where, you know, someone could just have an idea of like, okay, look, a more disruptive Absol box is the way to go. Someone else could go, oh, an Absol box with a Zoroark in it for extra draw. You know what I mean? Like, you could see crazy things because it just is room. No one's going to play with Zoroark in it, by the way. That was a really bad example, but I'm spitballing. Just ideas. There are things you can put in the deck to make it a little bit more spicy and have a little bit more corners on the edge of its shape. And I think that that is one of the most impressive parts of the deck. But finally, spoiler alert, Gardevoir is number one. For me, it is and always has been the Bediff. I think that every single time I've made a tier list, every single time I've spoken to my friends, I've always said Gardevoir's the best deck in format. Every time that it's supposedly not the best deck in format, it wins. Every time, you know, it doesn't make a top 8 one week, it makes 3 or 4 the week after. I think that the problem with Gardevoir, that you will never, ever, ever be able to stay ahead of the curve because all the builds of Gardevoir are good. And that's why I've got Gardevoir as a whole. Jelly Guardy, high bravery charm Guardy, sort of a more sniping and spreading Guardy, all of them are good top to bottom. And the fact that it is able to sort of adapt and be so resilient and put in tech cards, you know, we've seen a Namorous already this year come and go. Could that come back in? Who knows? You know what I mean? So it's just like the sort of random cards that can sort of come in and out of the deck. You know, you could be playing against one person, they could be playing one bravery charm. You could go to the next matchup, they could be playing 3. And so you can't ever play the same game plan into Guardy every time because you don't know what your opponent has. And it's almost like you can sit down, follow a game plan, find out they've got something different, lose the first game, and you've got 2 turns to try and play correctly. But obviously, Guardy's a very strong deck. So there's no chance that when you are playing correctly, you're going to get over the line against it. And so I do think that is like a advantage that Gardevoir has versus a lot of decks that not any other deck in the format can boast. That you can almost sit down and you have no idea what your opponent's going to pull out. They could play a Jelly Line and a Drifloon, but there's no way that you're going to know that. And whether that's optimal or unoptimal, if you don't see it coming, it's always going to be optimal. You know, if you don't think your big 300 HP stage 2 attacker can be knocked out because they're playing Jelly Guardy, and all of a sudden they slap down a Drifloon and they go straight through it, it's correct because they've been able to play around you. And so I do think that you know, there are merits to play any build of Guardy. I do think that Jelly Guardy will be the more popular thing, just because I think that, again, those aggressive archetypes that a lot of Latin America likes to play will be in the higher played numbers. So I do think Jelly Guardy sort of stopping those superior energy retrievals, earthen vessels for discarding energies, and something like Ceruledge, so on and so forth. I do think it will be the more played deck. However, I think any type of Guardy could win this weekend. And as I continue to allude to, it's just the strength of the players playing this deck, you know, not just someone like Henry Chow, but we have seen, you know, world champions play on this deck. You know, you've seen Tord himself play this deck in Europe a couple of weeks ago with a trolley build. You know, you've seen every player, top to bottom, who is good at the game, play this. You know, Kel Connor. You see, you know, I could name hundreds of people, but all of them top players. All of them will have ideas. All of them will have text. All of them will have inclusions that you might not see coming. And then there's the man himself, Henry Chan, who could just come up with something all new, all together, and that is a very scary prospect and something that I don't think anyone will be able to stay ahead of. It's impossible, and that is why Gardevoir is number one for me, and the deck that I think is not necessarily something I'm putting forward and saying it will win LAIC, but the deck that I feel is always most likely to win any tournament. in the current format. And I, for one, cannot wait for it to rotate for that reason. So yeah, that is all. Thank you very much for watching. If you are traveling to Sao Paulo, safe travels, and of course, good luck. I would love if anyone watching this or subscribe or anything like that who is going, please let me know how you do. Let me know what you're picking. Let me know what you think the top 10 best decks are. I always enjoy sort of making videos like this because I'm definitely not 100% correct 100% of the time. And it's really cool to sort of discuss your opinions with other people and see just how wrong you are sometimes. So, yeah, like if anyone fancies a little bit of a discussion, please, please, please comment below, send me a message, do whatever. It would be great to have sort of a chat. I am going to a League Cup this weekend on the Saturday, and I've got a pretty slow day actually and work on Friday, so I might be able to catch them with day one. Definitely watching the night on the Saturday, but I will 100% be around to watch Championship Sunday. I always enjoy watching the VGC at these events as well. I am into the VGC as well, so very, very, very excited for our first international this year. I only wish I was there. But as I said, everyone traveling, good luck. Everyone commentating, all the staff, have a safe time and safe travels. And I will see you tomorrow for my predictions of what I think is going to do well. And if not, then I'll see you in the next video for some Phantasmal Flames stuff. I've got some cool ideas in mind that I want to go through. And yeah, very excited to make that content with you. I will be pretty much back to normal starting next week, back to normal hours and work and at home. So thanks again for watching. Enjoy LAIC this weekend. And until next time, peace out from Professor Benji.